On the night of September 23, 1988, Marty's pawn shop in Gary, Indiana, became the scene of one of the most puzzling robberies in the city's history. 3 masked men stormed the establishment at closing time, making off with approximately $340,000 in gold jewelry, coins, and rare collectibles. But this wasn't just any robbery. Among the stolen items was a collection that had been whispered about in certain circles for decades. Gold pieces allegedly connected to Thomas Mallory, a notorious gangster who had controlled much of Gary's underworld operations during the 1940s and early 1950s. The case went cold within months, despite the best efforts of the Gary Police Department and consultation with the FBI. What the investigators didn't know was that the answer to the mystery lay not in the criminal underworld they were searching, but in the most unlikely of places, buried 6 feet under in Oakwood Cemetery, where a quiet groundskeeper named Jamal Hayes went about his solitary work, unknowing that he walked daily over a fortune that would reshape everything he understood about his own family. The truth wouldn't surface until 2002, when a routine grave maintenance project led to a discovery that would connect a 1940s gangster, a 1988 heist, and a family secret that had been buried for over 50 years. This is the story of how greed, betrayal, and the weight of inherited sins can remain hidden in the most sacred of places, only to emerge when least expected. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Jamal Hayes had worked at Oakwood Cemetery since 1985, taking over the position from his father, Robert Hayes, who had tended the grounds for nearly 30 years before him. The job suited Jamal's temperament. He was a man who preferred the company of silence to conversation, who found peace in the methodical work of maintaining the sprawling cemetery grounds on the south side of Gary. At 32 years old in 1988, he had settled into a life that many might have found depressing, but which gave him a sense of purpose and stability that had eluded him in his younger years. Gary, Indiana, in the late 1980s, was a city struggling with its identity. Once a thriving steel town, it had watched its economic foundation crumble as mills closed and jobs disappeared. The population had declined steadily since the 1960s, and with that decline came the inevitable rise in crime and desperation. Oakwood Cemetery, established in 1878, sat on 43 acres of gently rolling land, a green sanctuary in a city that had seen better days. The cemetery held over 60,000 graves, many dating back to Gary's founding, and among them were the final resting places of some of the city's most prominent citizens. As well as some of its most notorious, Jamal knew the cemetery, like most people knew their own homes. He could navigate its winding paths in complete darkness, knew which sections flooded after heavy rains, understood the quirks of the aging infrastructure. His daily routine began at dawn, checking the grounds for any overnight disturbances, maintaining the landscaping, assisting with burial preparations, and keeping the administrative records organized in the small office building near the main entrance. It was steady work that paid $24,000 a year, enough for a modest apartment and a simple life. But Jamal carried secrets that weighed heavier than any gravestone he'd helped set. His uncle, Eddie Reardon, had been a figure of both fascination and shame in the Hayes family. Eddie had disappeared in 1953 when Jamal was not yet born, but the stories had been passed down. Eddie had worked for Thomas Mallory during the gangster's heyday, serving as one of his most trusted associates. Mallory had controlled gambling, extortion, and smuggling operations throughout Gary and the surrounding areas, accumulating wealth that seemed impossible for a man of his background. Eddie Reardon's name was rarely spoken in the Hayes household, but Jamal's father had let certain details slip over the years. Usually, after too many drinks, Eddie had been smart, ambitious, and utterly without conscience when it came to business. He had helped Mallory expand his operations, served as an enforcer when necessary, and had earned a reputation as someone who could solve problems that others couldn't. But then, in early 1953, just months before Mallory died of a heart attack, Eddie had vanished. No body was ever found. No explanation was ever given. The family had assumed he'd crossed the wrong people and met the fate that many of Mallory's associates eventually did. What Jamal's father had told him late one night in 1983 was something that had haunted Jamal ever since. Eddie hadn't been killed. Eddie had run because he'd stolen from Mallory. A substantial portion of the gangster's fortune gold, primarily. Coins, jewelry, bars. Mallory had been converting his cash holdings into gold throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. Paranoid about federal investigations and the instability of keeping large amounts of currency, Eddie had been entrusted with hiding this gold in various locations around Gary, known only to himself and Mallory. But Eddie had decided that his loyalty was worth less than his future, and he'd made arrangements to disappear with the gold, or at least a significant portion of it. Robert Hayes had sworn his son to secrecy about this family history. The old gangster connections were dangerous even decades later, and there were still people who remembered, who held grudges, who would be interested to know that Eddie Reardon had a nephew working in the very cemetery where Mallory himself was buried. On the night of September 23, 1988, Jamal had been working late, repairing a section of fence along the cemetery's eastern border that had been damaged by a fallen tree. He had heard the sirens around 9:15, seen the flashing lights of police cars racing down Broadway Avenue, just 2 blocks from the cemetery. By the time he finished his work and drove past Marty's pawn shop on his way home, the entire block was cordoned off. Ambulances and police vehicles creating a chaos of light and noise in the darkness. The next morning, the robbery was all anyone in Gary could talk about. 3 men, armed with handguns, had entered Marty's pawn shop 17 minutes before closing. Martin Kowalski, the 73-year-old owner, and his grandson Derek, who helped run the business, had been forced to the floor at gunpoint. The robbers had known exactly what they wanted. They'd gone straight to the back room, to a specific locked cabinet, and demanded the keys. Inside that cabinet was a collection that Marty had acquired 6 months earlier from an estate sale, the estate of Vincent Mallory, Thomas Mallory's youngest son, who had died of liver disease in February 1988. The collection included gold coins from the 1920s and 1930s, several pieces of jewelry including a distinctive thick gold chain with a medallion bearing Mallory's initials, rare gold pocket watches, and approximately 40 gold bars, each weighing 1 troy ounce. The total value was estimated at $340,000, though some collectors suggested the true value might be higher given the historical significance of items connected to Thomas Mallory. Vincent Mallory had held onto these pieces for decades, and their appearance on the market had generated significant interest among certain collectors who understood what they represented. The robbery had been swift and professional. The men had taken exactly what they came for, ignored the other valuable items in the shop, and disappeared into the night. Martin Kowalski survived but was badly shaken. Derek had been pistol-whipped when he'd hesitated to open the cabinet, requiring 12 stitches. No customers had been present. The security camera footage showed 3 African-American males, approximately 5'9" to 6'1", wearing ski masks, dark clothing, and gloves. They'd spoken minimally, their voices muffled. They'd left no fingerprints, no usable DNA evidence. They'd been in and out in under 6 minutes. Jamal had followed the news coverage with growing unease. Something about the robbery felt connected to his family's history, to the stories his father had told him about Eddie and Mallory. When Detective Malik Carter was assigned to lead the investigation, Jamal's anxiety increased. Malik had grown up 3 streets away from Jamal, had attended the same high school, though Malik was 4 years younger. They'd been friendly, though never close friends. Malik had joined the Gary Police Department in 1984, and by 1988, he'd already developed a reputation as a sharp, dedicated investigator who took cases personally. Malik began his investigation with the logical assumption that the robbery was an inside job, or that someone with knowledge of Mallory's collection had planned it. He interviewed Martin Kowalski extensively, traced everyone who had shown interest in the collection, and investigated Vincent Mallory's associates and family members. The investigation consumed him. This wasn't just another robbery. This was a piece of Gary's history, and solving it would make his career. What Jamal couldn't tell Malik, what he couldn't tell anyone, was what he'd witnessed that night while working late at the cemetery. Around 8:45, 15 minutes before the robbery, he'd seen a car parked along the cemetery's western edge, near a section of graves that dated to the 1950s. It wasn't unusual for people to visit graves in the evening, but something had made Jamal watch. 3 men had emerged from the car, and in the dim light from a distant street lamp, Jamal had seen that one of them was wearing something that caught the light: a thick gold chain. Even from a distance, even in the darkness, it had been distinctive. The men had spent approximately 15 minutes among the graves in that section, and Jamal had watched them from behind a maintenance shed, something instinctive telling him to remain hidden. They'd been looking at something, discussing something, one of them appearing to take measurements or notes. Then they'd left, driving away in the direction of downtown Gary. 30 minutes later, the sirens had started. Jamal had realized, with a sick certainty, that he'd just witnessed the robbers preparing for their crime. And that gold chain one of them had been wearing. It matched descriptions of the Mallory chain that would be stolen less than an hour later, which meant they'd already had access to at least part of the collection, or they'd stolen it earlier, or somehow they'd known exactly where to find it. But Jamal couldn't report what he'd seen without drawing attention to himself, to his family's connection to Mallory. More importantly, he'd begun to suspect something that terrified him. The section of the cemetery where those men had been standing, where they'd been so focused on the graves, was the section where Thomas Mallory was buried. And nearby, in an area of unmarked graves that had been used for paupers' burials in the 1950s, was an area that Jamal's father had once drunkenly referred to as Eddie's insurance policy. Over the following weeks, as Malik's investigation continued and eventually stalled, Jamal began his own private research. He spent his evenings in the cemetery's administrative office, going through old records, maps, and burial logs from the 1950s. The record-keeping from that era had been inconsistent, and there were gaps and discrepancies that had never been fully resolved. Some graves had been marked incorrectly. Some burial records didn't match the physical locations. It was bureaucratic chaos that had accumulated over decades. Jamal found what he was looking for in a leather-bound ledger from 1953, filed incorrectly with records from 1958. There was an entry for a plot in Section 17, an area designated for indigent burials, dated April 15, 1953. The entry simply read, "E.R. Storage, City Contract." No name, no death certificate number. Just a cryptic notation and a plot number that, when Jamal checked the physical location, corresponded to an unmarked patch of ground near the Mallory family plot. His father had told him the truth, Jamal realized. Eddie hadn't run away with Mallory's gold. He'd hidden it. And he'd hidden it in the one place where no one would think to look, where it could remain undisturbed for decades, protected by the sanctity and permanence of a cemetery. Eddie had buried the gold in a grave, creating a false burial record, and then disappeared. Perhaps he'd intended to return for it someday. Perhaps he'd been killed before he could. But the gold had remained, buried and forgotten, while Thomas Mallory died never knowing where his fortune had gone, and while his family gradually sold off whatever remained of his estate. The three men who'd robbed Marty's pawnshop had somehow learned about the hidden gold. Jamal didn't know how, but they'd known enough to visit the cemetery the night of the robbery, to examine the area, to confirm something. They'd stolen Mallory's collection from the pawnshop not just for its value, but as a first step toward recovering something much larger. They were looking for Eddie Reardon's treasure. Jamal faced an impossible decision. He could report his suspicions to Malik, but that would expose his family's connection to Mallory and potentially implicate his father, who might have known more than he'd admitted. He could remain silent and hope the robbers never returned, never found what they were looking for. Or he could investigate himself, confirm whether the gold was actually there, and decide what to do with that knowledge. For weeks, Jamal agonized over his choices. Meanwhile, Malik's investigation produced no leads. The FBI had been consulted given the value of the theft and potential interstate commerce violations, but they had nothing to work with. The trail had gone completely cold. The three robbers had vanished as thoroughly as Eddie Reardon had in 1953. Martin Kowalski's insurance covered most of his loss, though the historical value of the Mallory items could never be replaced. The case was filed but remained open. One more unsolved crime in a city that had accumulated too many of them. In late November 1988, during the first major snowfall of winter, Jamal made his decision. Working alone on a Sunday afternoon when the cemetery was closed to visitors, he took a shovel and a post-hole digger to Section 17. He'd chosen a day when the ground hadn't yet frozen solid, but when the weather would keep any potential witnesses away. The snow fell steadily, muffling sound, creating a white curtain around him as he worked. He dug carefully, methodically, in the exact location indicated by the 1953 burial record. 2 feet down, his shovel struck something solid. 4 feet down, he'd uncovered what appeared to be a concrete vault, though much smaller than the standard burial vaults used for coffins. The vault had no markings, no identifying information. Jamal's hands shook as he worked to expose more of it. He couldn't open it alone, not without tools he didn't have access to without raising questions. He covered his excavation, disguising it as a settled grave, and marked the location in his memory. Then he went home and spent a sleepless night considering what he'd discovered. His Uncle Eddie had been clever. Instead of risking moving the gold out of Gary, trying to sell it or exchange it, he'd created a permanent hiding place. The concrete vault would protect the gold from moisture and deterioration. The cemetery location meant it would remain undisturbed, protected by laws and social customs that made it unlikely anyone would ever dig there without official cause. But Eddie had failed to account for one thing. He hadn't survived to retrieve his treasure. Whether he'd been killed by Mallory's other associates, died in an accident while fleeing, or met some other fate, he'd left his secret in the ground. And somehow, 40 years later, someone else had learned about it. Jamal made the decision that would define the next 14 years of his life. He would leave the gold buried. He would say nothing to Malik, nothing to anyone. The gold was cursed, tainted by the criminal actions that had acquired it, and disturbing it would only bring more violence and trouble. He would guard Eddie's secret not to protect the treasure but to contain it, to keep it from causing more harm. But he began watching Section 17 with paranoid attention. Every visitor to that area of the cemetery, every car that parked nearby, every unexpected sound in the night made his heart race. He installed a motion sensor light near his maintenance shed, claiming it was for security. He began keeping irregular hours, sometimes sleeping in the cemetery office, telling himself it was dedication to his job when it was really anxiety that the robbers would return. Months passed. A year, 2 years. The snow covered the ground each winter and melted each spring, and the grass grew over Jamal's excavation site, erasing the evidence of his discovery. Malik Carter was promoted to detective in 1990 and was eventually transferred to Hammond, where he continued building his career. The pawnshop robbery remained unsolved, a cold case that occasionally Malik would review, still frustrated by its mysteries. Jamal continued his work at Oakwood Cemetery, his life defined by routine and vigilance. He never married, never left Gary, never strayed far from the graves he tended. People who knew him considered him devoted to his work, perhaps a bit eccentric, but reliable and conscientious. None of them knew that he was standing guard over a fortune, that every day he walked past a grave that contained enough gold to transform his life, that he had deliberately chosen poverty and obscurity over the wealth that lay just beneath his feet. His father died in 1994, taking whatever additional secrets he might have held to his own grave in Oakwood Cemetery. Jamal buried him in Section 12, far from the Mallory plots. Far from Section 17, he maintained his father's grave with the same meticulous care he gave all the others. And sometimes he wondered if he'd made the right choice, if his father would have wanted him to claim Eddie's treasure, or would have approved of Jamal's decision to leave it buried. The years accumulated like the leaves that fell each autumn onto the cemetery grounds. 1995, 1996, 1997. Gary continued its slow decline, losing population, losing hope. The cemetery saw fewer burials as families moved away or chose cremation. Jamal's salary increased slowly, barely keeping pace with inflation. He lived simply, saved what he could, and tried not to think about the fortune that remained buried in Section 17, just yards from where he worked each day. The weight of the secret aged him in ways that his 50-some years couldn't fully explain. By 2002, Jamal Hayes was 46 years old and had worked at Oakwood Cemetery for 17 years. The cemetery had fallen on hard times financially, struggling to maintain its operations as burial revenues declined and maintenance costs increased. The board of directors had secured a grant from the city to perform necessary infrastructure repairs, updating drainage systems, reinforcing older grave sites that had settled or deteriorated, and modernizing record-keeping systems. The project began in early March 2002, bringing construction crews to the cemetery for the first time in decades. Jamal watched with growing dread as the work progressed. Knowing that eventually the crews would reach Section 17, he'd tried to subtly discourage work in that area, claiming the ground was more stable there, that other sections needed more urgent attention, but the project had a schedule and a plan, and his suggestions were politely noted and then ignored. On April 9, 2002, almost exactly 49 years after Eddie Reardon had buried his treasure, a backhoe operator named Carlos Mendez was excavating a drainage trench through Section 17 when his equipment struck something solid. Initially assuming it was bedrock or an old utilities line, he dug more carefully. What he uncovered was the edge of a concrete vault, approximately 4 feet below the surface, in a location that according to cemetery records was an unmarked indigent burial from 1953. The construction supervisor halted work and notified Jamal, who felt his stomach drop when he saw the exposure. The vault had been partially damaged by the backhoe, revealing what appeared to be metal containers inside. What should have been bones in a coffin was instead something that gleamed dully in the spring sunlight: gold. The supervisor made the required notifications. Within 3 hours, the cemetery grounds were swarming with police officers, investigators from the Hammond Police Department where Malik Carter now worked as a senior detective, FBI agents, and city officials. The vault was carefully excavated and opened. Inside were 12 sealed metal ammunition boxes, military surplus from World War II era, each containing gold coins, jewelry, and small bars. A preliminary estimate valued the contents at approximately $2.8 million in 2002 market prices, though the true value of the gold at the time it was hidden in 1953 would have been significantly less due to inflation and changes in gold prices. Also in the vault were documents, papers sealed in wax-coated leather folders that had protected them from moisture, inventory lists in Eddie Reardon's handwriting, detailing exactly what was in each ammunition box. Letters Eddie had written but never sent, explaining his actions. A confessional document dated April 1953, laying out the entire story of how he'd systematically stolen from Thomas Mallory, how he'd been skimming gold from the operations he was trusted to manage, how he'd created the false burial record at Oakwood Cemetery and hidden the fortune there. The most damning document was a list of names, men Eddie had worked with, men who'd helped him in various ways, men who'd been part of Mallory's organization. Some of those names were well known in Gary's history. Others were names that still meant something in 2002, belonging to elderly men or their descendants who had tried to leave their criminal pasts behind. Malik Carter arrived at the cemetery at 6:30 that evening, called in because of his knowledge of the 1988 Marty's pawn shop robbery. He'd never forgotten that case, had reviewed the file dozens of times over the years, and when he heard that gold connected to Thomas Mallory had been found buried at Oakwood Cemetery, he'd immediately made the connection. He stood at the excavation site, looking at the opened vault, at the boxes of gold, at the documents being carefully photographed and catalogued, and felt a cold certainty. This was what the 1988 robbers had been looking for. When Malik learned that Jamal Hayes was the cemetery groundskeeper, he sought him out immediately. The two men hadn't seen each other in years, and Malik was shocked by how much Jamal had aged. They stood together near the maintenance shed as the sun set, and Malik asked careful questions about the cemetery records, about whether Jamal had known about the vault, about Section 17 Jamal, exhausted by 14 years of carrying his secret, made a decision. He told Malik the truth, not all of it, but enough. He explained his family's connection to Eddie Reardon, admitted that his father had told him stories about Mallory's missing gold. He confessed that after the 1988 robbery, he'd become suspicious and had conducted his own investigation of the cemetery records. He admitted finding the burial record for the vault, and even confessed to the excavation he'd done in November 1988, though he claimed he'd only confirmed the vault's presence and then reburied it, too afraid of the consequences to report it. What Jamal didn't tell Malik was that he'd seen the three robbers in the cemetery the night of the heist. That detail he kept to himself, a final protection for his own involvement, however peripheral. Malik listened to Jamal's partial confession with a mixture of frustration and understanding. He couldn't charge Jamal with any crime. Finding an old burial record wasn't illegal, and Jamal's decision not to report his discovery, while questionable, didn't rise to the level of criminal obstruction. The statute of limitations on any potential charges had long since expired. But Malik pressed Jamal on one crucial question. How had the 1988 robbers known about the gold? Jamal had no answer, or at least none that he would admit. The investigation that followed the discovery of the vault would eventually reveal part of that answer. Among Eddie Reardon's documents was a letter addressed to his sister, Jamal's grandmother, that had never been mailed. In it, Eddie had hinted at his actions, suggested that if anything happened to him, certain information could be found in specific places. The letter had apparently been mailed after all, or perhaps a copy had been made because investigators eventually traced the information through several family connections. One of those connections led to Deshaun Williams, a 47-year-old Gary resident who'd been arrested in 1997 for receiving stolen property. Deshawn's mother had been close friends with Eddie Reardon's sister in the 1950s. In the decades that followed, rumors and stories had circulated in certain circles about Eddie's betrayal of Mallory. About gold that had disappeared, Deshawn had heard these stories growing up and had spent years piecing together fragments of information. When Vincent Mallory's estate was being liquidated in 1988, when his collection of his father's gold pieces appeared at Marty's pawn shop, Deshawn had made a connection. If Vincent had held on to some of Thomas Mallory's gold all these years, that meant there'd been gold to keep. And if the stories about Eddie Reardon were true, there was much more gold somewhere Deshawn had recruited his cousin Leon Williams and a friend, Terrence Jackson, and they'd spent months in 1988 researching Oakwood Cemetery records, investigating the Mallory burial plots, looking for any anomaly that might indicate a hiding place. They'd found the cryptic 1953 burial record. They'd visited the cemetery the night of September 23rd to confirm the location and to steel their nerves. Then they'd robbed the pawn shop, taking Vincent Mallory's collection both for its immediate value and as a kind of down payment on what they hoped to find. Their plan had been to excavate the vault in Section 17, but they'd been cautious. They'd watched the cemetery for weeks after the robbery, looking for opportunities. They'd seen Jamal's increased vigilance, his unusual hours, and had wondered if he somehow knew about the vault. Eventually, they'd decided the risk was too great. The three men had divided the proceeds from the pawn shop robbery and moved on with their lives, always intending to return to Oakwood Cemetery someday, always believing the larger fortune was there waiting. Deshawn Williams had died in a car accident in 1999. Leon Williams had moved to California in 1993. Only Terrence Jackson was still in the Gary area in 2002, working as a mechanic, living a quiet life, and trying to forget about the gold that had haunted his dreams for 14 years. The FBI investigation that followed the vault's discovery eventually identified all three 1988 robbers through a combination of witness interviews, investigation of Eddie Reardon's family connections, and forensic accounting of the gold that had been recovered from the vault. Terrence Jackson was arrested in May 2002, and faced with overwhelming evidence and the knowledge that his co-conspirators were dead or beyond reach, cooperated fully with investigators. He confessed to the pawn shop robbery, explained their research and planning, and confirmed what investigators had already suspected, that the 1988 robbery and the buried gold were directly connected. Martin Kowalski, 87 years old in 2002, learned that the crime that had traumatized him 14 years earlier had finally been solved. His grandson Derek, who still bore the scar from his pistol whipping, expressed relief that at least part of the mystery had been resolved, though the gold stolen from the pawn shop had long since been fenced and could never be recovered. The gold from the vault presented complex legal questions. It was stolen property, taken from Thomas Mallory's criminal operations in the 1940s and early 1950s. But Mallory had been dead for 49 years, and his estate had been settled decades ago. His surviving family members, grandchildren primarily, had no legal claim to gold that had never been part of the official estate. The federal government claimed the gold under asset forfeiture laws, arguing it was the proceeds of criminal enterprise. After 3 years of legal wrangling, the gold was sold at auction in 2005, with the proceeds divided between the federal government, the state of Indiana, and the city of Gary, with a small portion going to the Oakwood Cemetery for maintenance and restoration work. Jamal Hayes received no portion of the gold, which seemed fitting to him. He'd spent 14 years guarding Eddie Reardon's treasure, sacrificing any chance of claiming it because he'd understood what it truly represented. Not wealth, but cursed goods that had brought nothing but violence and betrayal to everyone who had touched them. The gold had gotten Thomas Mallory killed, his paranoia and greed consuming him. It had driven Eddie Reardon to betrayal, and likely to his death. It had led Deshaun Williams, Leon Williams, and Terrence Jackson to commit violent robbery, and it had trapped Jamal in a prison of his own making, turning his life into an extended act of penance for sins he'd inherited rather than committed. In the aftermath of the discovery, Jamal gave several interviews to local news outlets. He spoke carefully, revealing only what had become public record, maintaining the fiction that he'd been an innocent bystander to events beyond his control. Only Malak Carter suspected there was more to Jamal's story, but Malik chose not to push. The case was solved. Justice had been served to the extent it could be, and whatever Jamal had left unsaid was his burden to carry, the Marty's pawnshop robbery, had been solved 14 years after the fact. The mystery of Thomas Mallory's missing fortune had been resolved 70 years after it had first disappeared. Eddie Reardon's fate remained unknown, but his role in one of Gary's most enduring criminal mysteries had finally been exposed. The cemetery worker who'd walked over a fortune for 14 years had proven that sometimes the greatest treasure was the integrity to leave something buried. Jamal Hayes continued working at Oakwood Cemetery until his retirement in 2015. He'd spent 30 years tending the graves of the dead, 30 years maintaining the ground that had held so many secrets. Section 17 was restored after the vault's removal. The ground carefully filled and replanted. Nothing visible to indicate what had once been hidden there. Visitors to Thomas Mallory's grave would occasionally stop and ask Jamal about the gangster buried there, about the stories they'd heard. He'd answer briefly, politely, and then return to his work. He died in 2019 at the age of 63, his heart finally giving out from decades of stress and secrets. He was buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Section 12 near his father's grave. At his funeral, Malak Carter was one of only 15 attendees. Malak had risen to become chief of detectives in Hammond before his own retirement, and he'd never forgotten the cemetery worker who'd helped solve one of his most frustrating cold cases. In his eulogy, Malak spoke about Jamal's dedication to his work, his quiet integrity, and his understanding that some things mattered more than money. What Malik didn't say, what perhaps only he fully understood, was that Jamal Hayes had spent most of his adult life as a guardian of something he could never claim, a sentinel over a treasure he'd refused to touch. In a world that valued wealth above almost everything else, Jamal had chosen duty, secrecy, and a kind of honor that belonged to an earlier age. He'd lived in poverty while walking over millions, had worked until his body gave out while others retired in comfort, had died with secrets that went with him to his grave. The story of the cemetery worker and the buried gold became one of Gary's most famous unsolved mysteries, even after it was technically solved. It was featured in true crime documentaries, written about in books, discussed in online forums. People debated whether Jamal Hayes had been noble or foolish, whether he should have claimed the gold or reported it immediately. Some called him a hero, others called him an accomplice. The truth, as it usually is, was more complicated than either extreme. In the end, the gold that Thomas Mallory had accumulated through violence and extortion, that Eddie Reardon had stolen and hidden, that Deshaun Williams and his crew had sought to steal again, brought lasting benefit to no one except the governmental entities that ultimately claimed it. The money funded some city improvements in Gary, helped maintain Oakwood Cemetery's grounds, and disappeared into bureaucratic budgets. The historical significance of the case outlasted any material benefit anyone gained from the gold itself. The real legacy of the story was the lesson it taught about greed, about secrets, about the weight of inherited sins. Jamal Hayes had understood something that the others hadn't, that some treasures are too expensive to claim, that some inheritances are better refused. He'd chosen to leave the gold buried not because he was weak or foolish, but because he understood that claiming it would have cost him something more valuable than money. It would have cost him his peace, his integrity, and his sense of who he was. On his grave marker in Oakwood Cemetery, Section 12, there's no mention of the gold, no reference to the role he played in one of Gary's most famous criminal cases, just his name, his dates, and a simple phrase, faithful servant. To those who knew the full story, those two words carried a weight that no amount of gold could measure.